Director, Daniel. Daniel, thank you for recording this meeting. And this is our Anti-Displacement Campaign Workshop. This is where we're going to do sort of a mini deep dive into the issue of displacement in a general sense, and then we'll talk a little bit about it in the context of Washington, D.C. And then I'll share a little bit about some of the work Empower DC is doing to fight displacement, and we'll have a community discussion on how, we can add to that work. And I also am going to open up the opportunity for folks to get involved in that work that we're doing to stop displacement. So welcome, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. One moment. All righty. So if you haven't done so already, please feel free to put your name and your where you're calling from, your ward, and what brought you here today in the chat. We want to hear from you. So before we get into the workshop, I'll just quickly go over our agenda. So we already did our welcome and introductions. We're still doing that. Feel free to, again, share your information with us. And I'm going to then talk a little bit about Empower DC, our mission and our values. And then I'll get into the campaign workshop. Then we'll have a community discussion. There'll be time for questions, and then we'll close out. So what is Empower DC? So Empower DC was founded in 2003. It's a grassroots organization, and it was founded by Linda Leaks and our current executive director, Parisa Narozi. Our vision is DC is a state where human rights and needs are met and systemic harms are exposed and repaired, and empowered residents shape the decisions that impact their lives. Our mission is to build the power of DC residents through resident-led community organizing to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice, and I'm going to add to that housing justice. Our organizational values is to honor the history, expertise, and vision of low and moderate income Black and Brown residents, to build collective power that demands accountability from decision makers, to disrupt inequitable and unjust systems and institutions, and to persist in the determined, uncompromising pursuit of justice. And like I said, we do that in many ways. One of those ways that we'll be talking about a lot today is our housing justice work. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of some of the things we do. I will do a deeper dive as we talk about some of the ways that we're fighting displacement. So just to get a quick sense of some of the things we're doing, we are engaged in outreach. We are doing door-to-door canvassing to residents that are at risk of eviction and other forms of displacement. We are connecting people to legal support, and we're also recruiting leaders for our anti-displacement network, which is this space right here. We are also working in organizing in public housing and affordable housing. We're making sure that we're preserving public housing. We're, again, stopping displacement. And we want to expand access to quality affordable housing while also holding slum landlords accountable. And then we have our anti-displacement network, which is this space right here. And this is a space of tenants and organizers and advocates that are working to prevent the systemic displacement of low-income district residents through outreach, information sharing, and tenants' rights meetings, and other forms of education related to tenants' rights and housing justice. So before we get into the campaign workshop and, this huge issue of displacement, I would love to hear from you. And I'm just going to preface this now that this workshop is meant to be very interactive, and we will be making use of the chat very much. There's a lot of us in here, but we do want to hear from you. So periodically, I will have reflection questions throughout this workshop. I encourage you to put your responses in the chat. And to converse with each other. If you aren't able to respond in the chat now, don't worry. We will have that community discussion period where folks can come off mute and share their thoughts out loud. But if you are able to put in the chat, I would love to hear from you. What comes to mind when you hear the word displacement? I'm going to give us a couple minutes to just think about that question. What comes to mind when you hear the word displacement? Racial disparities, removal, yes. Settler colonialism, yep. Needs ignored, yes. Thank y'all so much for sharing that. Gentrification, fear, unannounced change. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. All of those are very, very clear indicators of displacement. I am trying to, one moment, I am attempting to, there we go. My apologies. So here is just an official definition of displacement that comes from the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. It comes from an article that was written by Ileana Golding, and it does contain a lot of the things that you all were already talking about in the chat. So displacement is a process by which residents are directly or indirectly pushed out of their homes and or communities due to policy choices, such as urban renewal, racially restrictive covenants, wealth disparities, unaffordable housing, and other pressures that are outside of their control. And there are different forms of displacement. And I'm going to take a moment to go through all these different forms. And I just want to say that there are, this is not an exhaustive list of different types of displacement and how it can show up. These are just some common examples. And I also want to say that these different forms often interact with each other. So, you know, you can have things like physical forms of displacement like eviction that are interacting, or excuse me, you can have economic forms of displacement like rising housing costs that are interacting with physical forms of displacement like eviction because people are unable to pay their rent, if that makes sense. So what are some forms of physical displacement? So some of the direct ways that you can be physically displaced include things like legal eviction, building redevelopment, without that right to return. We're seeing that we're very concerned about that a lot in the public housing space. We also are seeing things like tenants being manipulated out of their tenant opportunity to purchase act rights. And that's basically when a building owner decides to sell the building, tenants should have the right to purchase that building and to either convert it into a co-op or assign their own developer to it. But we're seeing tenants being manipulated out of that right. We are also seeing indirect forms of displacement, and that could be things like violence or uninhabitable conditions. Cultural displacement. Cultural displacement basically refers to when the tastes and the needs in other culturally responsive places in a community are basically taken away and replaced with things that with needs and spaces that fit the needs of another group. So an example of that would be, I know that can sound very abstract. An example of that can be things like Don't Mute DC, which was a movement that took place in like 2019. And it basically was a movement where a cell phone repair shop was playing, and also a sort of go-go hub was playing go-go music. And some of the neighboring tenants in a nearby luxury apartment complex were complaining about the noise and were attempting to shut down the playing of that music in that cultural center. So things like that is cultural displacement. Then there is also economic displacement. Economic displacement can include things like building buyouts or voluntary agreements to move. Because a lot of times when you see these voluntary agreements to move, you may get a payout or you may get some money, but maybe the money's not going very far and the person ends up housing insecure. And then there's also examples like foreclosure. There's also indirect examples of economic displacement that includes things like rising housing costs and also rising rents. Then there's exclusionary displacement. This refers more to discriminatory practices and policies, things like voucher discrimination, restrictive zoning codes, historically that happened, that restricted Black folks from moving into certain parts of the city. Also, prevented, just going to meet this person here. And also zoning codes that prevented single family housing, which also can prevent people from home ownership, which is a key form of growing generational wealth. And then there's also indirect forms of exclusionary displacement. Excuse me. This can include things like lack of affordable housing, lack of resources like grocery stores, and other things that people need to be able to thrive in their community. So now that we talked about some of the different forms of displacement, we're going to get into the different impacts of displacement. And before I go into what we have to share with you today, I would love to hear from you. What are some of the impacts of displacement? And we'll take a couple moments to just share that in the chat. Yes, instability, loss of access, concentrations of wealth, inability to build generational wealth, children uprooted from schools. Yes, I love that word uprooted with this because there's actually a book I think called Root Shock too that speaks of this, but it is tearing people up from their roots. It is a traumatic thing, which we'll learn about in just a moment here. So what are some of the community impacts of displacement? One is the loss of access to essential community resources, things like grocery stores and schools. This is huge because you need these things to thrive, right? So if they're not around, it is causing people to leave. And it also destabilized interpersonal relationships, friendships, community systems of care, things like a neighbor who watches children after school. Very essential, informal relationships that are needed, again, for folks to thrive. Key words here are loss and destabilization, which I think came up a lot in the chat. So what are some of the household impacts of displacement? One is stress and other mental health related issues. So I have a study here that I saw. It was from the National excuse me, this long word, longitudinal study of adolescent to adult health. And this study basically showed that stress over housing insecurity can increase anxiety, depression, and risk of suicide. Physical health issues can also be manifested from this. This can include when mental health issues over housing insecurity show up in the physical body. And that could be things like elevated blood pressure, poor diet, worsened chronic medical conditions. It can also include things like long-term exposure to poor living conditions that have had negative impacts on the body. For example, one of the things I think we've seen a lot in our work is that exposure to mold is linked to things like asthma. And that's just one example of many. Another important impact, I think, related to homeowners that I just wanted to share was that displaced homeowners can lose an asset. Again, home ownership is one of the ways that we build generational wealth. So, that's a key asset that we're losing. And we're already dealing with a history of racial wealth gaps, which I'll talk a little bit about the, current wealth gaps that we have. So, having these assets taken away is very destabilizing. Okay.
Goals.
So now that we talked a little bit about displacement in a general sense and all of the impacts that come along with it, I want to talk to you a little bit about the situation in Washington, D.C. And before I get into what's happening currently, I think it's important to maybe go back to what happened historically. And I do just want to preface this by saying, again, this is a very brief overview of historical displacement in DC. You can do a whole deep dive on historical displacement in DC. So I just want to say this is a snapshot. And I just want to provide some key examples that kind of explain what we're seeing today. So we know that when you're talking about DC, it's important to remember that historically, we're already founded on displacement of indigenous communities, and also displacement of Black Africans who were enslaved. So we're already founded on that. And then we see different ways that it's shown up. And I'm going to focus mainly on the 20th century. So if you look at exclusionary displacement in the 20th century, you see that racially restrictive policies and covenants controlled where Black people and other people of color could live and what type of housing they could access in DC. Racial covenants, so these racist practices that made white neighborhoods increasingly more valuable. You saw instances where white residents were collaborating with developers and planners to displace Black households and redevelop the remaining land into white-only neighborhoods. And one example of that, if you look in the picture that I have here, is Meridian Hill Park. So between the years of 1912 and 1936, 39 Black families and 1 white were displaced to make way for the construction of Meridian Hill Park. And if you see where these benches are, this is where the houses used to be. And they were able to do this through, I would argue, maybe other forms of exclusionary displacement in policy, things like eminent domain, where the government can expropriate private land for public use. And so this led to the spread of racially restrictive covenants in the nearby row home blocks around this area of 15th Street. So what else was happening as far as displacement historically in DC? We saw economic displacement. And I really wanted to focus on and show y'all disinvestment in urban renewal and its impacts. So during the mid-20th century, in the 50s and 60s, we saw a lot of white flight. And this is basically when white homeowners were selling their homes and moving to the suburbs as realtors were practicing block busting. And block busting is when, remember I said that the values of white neighborhoods were going up and the values of neighborhoods of color are not as high. So when people of color began moving into white neighborhoods, realtors would say your property values are going to go down, and white folks would move out. That's blockbusting. So this led to a lot of disinvestment in DC neighborhoods as developers began investing in expanding suburban housing, and they were disinvesting in urban DC. So without that investment, DC neighborhoods began to experience deterioration. And this makes this area ripe for things like urban renewal. And an example of that would be that as people are moving into the suburbs and this disinvestment is happening, we then see parts of Southwest being redeveloped. And then that's pushing 15,000 to 17,000 Black residents over the Anacostia River. And I also just want to mention that, you know, we know that folks have, there's a history of racial wealth gaps here, and Black folks are making less money, and the more affordable housing projects are being built east of the river. So we're seeing a concentration of displacement, folks being pushed east of the river due to need, and also due to things like urban renewal. And when I say need, I mean the need for affordable housing.
Like us on Facebook and follow us.
So what does that mean for what happens to Chocolate City and physical displacement? So DC, like I said, used to be, so DC used to be the first majority Black major US city, and it was called Chocolate City. But after the 1970s, the Black population began to decline. So we saw the process of disinvestment in urban DC and investment in the suburban areas that are surrounding DC, and then reinvestment in DC through a process of urban renewal, which is making prices go up. And as that's happening, the Black population is beginning to decline and also being pushed east of the river. And during the past 2 decades, the Black population has decreased by almost 58,000. And the white population has grown by about 86,000. And if you look at current census tracts, especially in an area, if we're looking at U Street, for example, which has an extreme lack of affordable housing, we saw a 90% decrease in the Black population since 1990. And how ironic that this is taken on U Street, where we have lots of artwork that depicts Black life, but we know that there aren't very many Black people that are able to afford to live here. So that was a lot of information. I do just want us to pause and take a moment to reflect. So considering all that we just learned, what stood out the most to you about historical displacement? What surprised you? Or what didn't surprise you? Oh, wonderful. And I see some great book suggestions in the chat too. So thank you so much. Please share your suggestions if you have other resources, and we can gather them together and send them out in a follow-up. And we will also share the resources we're using too. I should have said that. Yes. Systemic and methodical. Yes. Intentional and targeted. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing. Oops. Right. And some of it isn't surprising. You know, these things, like I said, they've been happening for generations. So it's definitely rooted in history. So I'm going to now move on to some of the things we're seeing currently. And before I do that, I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about economic disparities, because I think it's going to be pretty important to understand that before we get into economic displacement that we're seeing today. So here you see 2 charts. The first chart is it's just showing the different median household income levels according to race. And one more thing before I get into that chart, I just want to preface by saying that the median family income, which is what I'm going to be talking about here, those are income limits that are set by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and they're used to determine income eligibility levels for different housing subsidy programs. So that's what I'm talking about when I say MFI, or the median family income. So if you look at this chart here on the left, you see that the white income is $149,358, and the median family income for Black families is $60,891. So I just want to preference that DC has one of the highest white to Black median income gaps, about 3 times of major US cities. So we're seeing a lot of racial wealth gaps here. If you look to the right at this chart I have here on the right, This just breaks down the median family incomes. And what I just wanted us to notice about this, and you can look here and see the different incomes according to household size, and then you can compare what's considered low income to what the moderate income is. So for example, a household size of one that's in the extremely low income bracket, making 25,450. So that's 30% of what this moderate income is here. What I wanted us to notice about that is that, first of all, the income gaps between low and moderate are extremely high. And then also, if you look at the low income brackets, 30%, 50%, 60%, and 80%, you can see that there is a wide range of difference between 30% MFI versus 80% MFI. And that's going to be important when I move on to the next slide. Oops. So last year, the United Planning Organization found that over 44,000 DC households spend at least 50% of their income on housing costs. And 40,000 of those households, about 90%, have an annual income less than $50,000. So that means that they're in the very and extremely low income bracket, right? And those are the folks that are the most rent burdened. And I'm going to come back to this second point here. I just want to go to this third point first. So we're also seeing at the same time as people are rent burdened, a lack of affordable housing stock, a lack of expanded affordable housing stock. So the mayor has had a goal to create 36,000 homes by 2025. And this is also known as 36,000 by 2025, hashtag 36,000 by 2025. So by November of last year, DC met 85% of the overall goal, yet only met 2/3 of the goal for affordable units. And when they talk about what they mean as far as affordable units, it's 80% MFI or less. And I just want to note that, again, that is a huge range. 80% versus 30% is a huge difference. And typically what we've been seeing is that people that are in the 30% MFI bracket, their housing needs are not being met. And I do just have an example of the way this is playing out on U Street, which I was talking about earlier, that Black households in the U Street in Ward 1 have a MFI of $49,148. And affordable rent for that income would be up to $14,744 per year. Yet on U Street, we're seeing current rents for a one-bedroom at around $23,560 more than what most Ward 1 Black families can afford. So housing is super unaffordable, and we are especially not seeing the housing needs met for people that are in the 30% MFI bracket. Now I'm going to return to the second point here, and I won't have time to go into a whole bunch of detail about this example that I'm going to talk about, but I will point you to where you can find that information. So developers are also attempting to use public land to build more unaffordable housing. That is another form of economic displacement that we are seeing. And an example of that would be 1617 U Street, which is a project that we've been working on. I am not going to have time to dig into everything that's happening with that issue, but we do have a public briefing about it on our YouTube page. So we'll share that with you so you can do a deep dive on it. Okay. So besides all of that economic displacement, we are seeing physical displacement currently. So we're seeing rising eviction numbers. From January through March of this year, scheduled evictions in DC doubled compared to last year during the same period. 979 of those evictions were scheduled, and these are just the numbers here, my apologies. So 979 of evictions were scheduled through March compared to 491, just so you have a sense of what I mean when I say they doubled. And then 371 of the scheduled evictions that we saw in this first quarter were due to non-payment of rent compared to 178 evictions for other grounds. So that just proves again that we're seeing a lot of unaffordable housing that is driving displacement. So again, that economic displacement is interacting with that physical displacement. Everything is always working intersectionally. And then we have cultural displacement. And I mentioned this example earlier about Don't Mute DC. And it's just showing how culturally relevant spaces like go-go spaces are being, at times, they're being marketed and sold as an experience for folks who are not from that community. And those who made that culture are not even there. And then we're also seeing instances where people attempt to silence those communities and that culture. So what are we seeing as far as exclusionary displacement, as far as policy and the budget? And I think this budget season and all of the issues that came up in it, especially when it came to housing and how abysmal it was funded, really just shows what we're seeing as far as exclusionary displacement. So the budget in general is about $21.2 billion in total. And we saw this budget season that ERAP remains underfunded despite its high demand. Families aren't able to depend on pandemic era aid measures, things like economic stimulus checks, and housing costs continue to rise, as we just saw. So this is prompting more and more families to turn to ERAP. And we also know that ERAP is not a permanent affordable housing solution, which I'll talk about in a second too, that we need more affordable housing solutions. Other things that we're seeing is cuts to rapid rehousing, which means terminating over 2,000 families by July. And this is leading to more and more displacement. And we're also seeing situations with vouchers. So this past budget season, there was a huge problem in finding revenue sources, money to come into the budget to help, fund housing programs. So Robert White, the Housing Committee Chair, ended up taking money from other housing programs to fund additional vouchers. So basically, these housing resources are sort of cannibalizing themselves, which is not benefiting anyone. It is, of course, leading to exclusionary displacement. Another way that we're seeing this is in the form of lack of permanent affordable housing options. So even though the budget, we were able to maintain a lot of the money for public housing preservation, there is still a huge issue of public housing preservation being threatened by private investment and development. We're seeing a trend, and this is actually happening nationwide, of housing authorities and of the government wanting to phase out of the public housing and push it more into the private sector. We're also seeing of expanded affordable housing tools. We need to pass social housing. And if you don't know what social housing is yet, do not worry. I will talk a little bit about what social housing is a little bit later. So I want to hear from you all now. Considering everything that we just talked about as far as DC, and those were very general ideas, I want you to think about your own specific community, whether you're in DC or, I think most people are, but in your specific community, what do you think has prevented and or prompted displacement? So take a few minutes to share in the chat. What are some of the things you're seeing that prompted displacement in your community? Yes. So I'm seeing a lot of rising prices. People not wanting to use public land to build affordable housing. Yes. Aging residents unable to pass on their homes to families. Yes. We're not getting that generational wealth. Lack of jobs in training programs. Tenants not able to get assistance from ERAP. Yes. All of these things contribute. Please feel free to continue. Ooh, it took me all the way back. Please feel free to continue sharing in the chat. I'm just going to keep moving on, but again, we love these conversations. Please continue sharing your thoughts. So now that we've talked a lot about what's going on in our specific communities, you know, the types of things that we're seeing that are prompting displacement, let's talk a little bit about how we can organize to stop displacement. Oh, how is Empower DC organizing community power to stop displacement? One way we're doing that is through outreach and relationship building. And if you look at that picture on the right, that is a picture of our outreach team at a tabling event. I wanted to shout them out, Don and Jeremy. So this is basically, like I said earlier, we're going out, we're talking to people who are vulnerable to displacement due to, you know, being at risk of eviction, folks who are also, you know, vulnerable to displacement due to their economic status, due to issues in the building. We're doing that in order to build strong relationships with people that are needed to create community power that can act together. If we don't have those strong relationships, we're not able to act as a collective to be able to work on these issues that we're working on as far as displacement. Another thing that we're doing is education and leadership development. And one of the key ways that we're doing that is through this space right here, the Anti-Displacement Network. So we do a lot of educational know your rights trainings. We do information on ERAP. We also will be doing informational sessions on different policy and, you know, government issues like the budget that are impacting those that are most vulnerable to displacement. We also have our Know Your Rights Guide, which you can find on our website, and we'll share that with you. That is also a way to educate folks and to make sure that, you know, people are aware of their rights and are able to act accordingly. And why are we engaging in that work? So of course, our organization is resident centered. We're all about building community power. So of course, that means developing the leadership of the residents that we're working with. And it also means that we need to know about the systems that we're working in to change. We need to know how they're working so that we can change them. And we also need to spread knowledge that can stop displacement in the meantime, things like knowing your rights as we fight to stop displacement in the long term through different policy strategies and things like that. So another way that we are working to stop displacement is through our legal strategies. And this refers to working with legal service providers to hold slum landlords accountable for different conditions issues. This is work with specific properties, again, to hold slum landlords accountable and to hold other decision makers accountable. Another thing that we're engaged in is direct action. And of course, you got to turn up the heat. If we're not able to, if all these other things are not getting the message across, and of course, we continue to do those things, but if we have to turn up the heat, we engage in our direct action. One example of that recently is that we joined the Fair Budget Coalition, shout out to them, at their rally that they held at the Wilson Building during the budget season, particularly when the mayor was dropping her budget proposal, where she did not get away with this, but she was attempting to fund ERAP at only $20 million. So we were able to turn out at that rally and provide support. We are also engaged in policy and budget advocacy. So I'm going to start with the budget and that stuff first, and then I'll get back to the policy. So this budget season was rough, like we said. And in Power DC, we testified at the budget oversight hearings. We highlighted the already unaffordable housing, and we asked that the DC Council maintain the current ERAP funding, and also to make sure that they are funding public housing preservation and also increased oversight of DCHA. And then as far as policy advocacy, we are interested in policies that expand permanent affordable housing, things like social housing, which I'll talk about right now. So social housing basically refers to the Green New Deal for Housing Amendment Act of 2023. This was a bill that was introduced by Janice Lewis-George, Brianne Nadeau, Brooke Pinto, Anita Bonds, Robert White, Trayon White, and Charles Allen. And the reason why we're so interested in it is because of its deepened levels of affordability, and also its attention to the need to have affordable housing that is large enough for families. Because if you look at the charts that I shared a few slides ago, there was the amount of or if you look at the prices of a one-bedroom house one-bedroom unit, excuse me, compared to 2- and 3-bedroom, the one-bedroom unit is already high. And this makes it really hard for families to be able to live in DC and to have space. So at least 60% of the units in the social housing would be 2-bedroom or more, able to accommodate families of larger sizes. And at least 30% of those units would be affordable for households that are earning less than 30% of the MFI or the area median income. That's the same thing, which is that extremely low income bracket that I was talking about earlier. And another 30% would be available for households that are earning less than 50% of the area median income or very low income bracket. And also, it's important to note that these two groups, the extremely low income and very low income groups, would never pay more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And remember, we were just talking about how the majority of extremely low income families are housing cost burden. Right. So and some of the other ways that we're organizing community power to stop displacement is through storytelling. And I'm really excited about this because this is something we've been engaging with for a while, but we really want to amp it up now. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we're going to do that in a second. But, throughout the history of this organization, we've engaged in shifting power by shifting narratives through our public housing power videos, which basically is an opportunity for us to humanize a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the housing world. So this was an opportunity to shed light on our leaders and the things that they're facing in public housing. We've also had our Berry Farm film, which was another iteration of, again, shifting those narratives and showing how harmful displacement is, and showing the sorts of bonds and relationships that are broken with displacement. So we encourage you to take a look at that film. It's on the YouTube page. We'll share it with you at the end. And then our most recent way that we have engaged in shifting power by shifting narrative is through our work with NBC4 to create a story to counter the mayor's narratives about ERAP. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, and during the budget season, Mayor Bowser was attempting to she wanted to cut the funding for ERAP and only fund it at $20 million. Um, and she was saying that the reason why she wanted to do this, or why this was so important, was because people were not really using ERAP for emergencies. They were committing fraud. They were trying to game the system. And so we worked with NBC4 to just counter that narrative, because of course, it had no proof. And it just shows the lack of understanding of how we're seeing all this unaffordable housing in the first place that's causing so many people to turn to ERAP. It's just she was painting a very incomplete picture of the story, and a very not fact-based picture of the story. So I want to show a clip of this video, and I think I saw Miss Mason here, which is the resident that we worked with on this project. So in a few moments, I'm going to ask Miss Mason if she's here to come off mute and just share some of her experience. But for now, I just want to show a little clip of the NBC4 story, so you can see how we have shifted power by shifting narrative. Daniel, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and maybe you can pull up the video.
Yeah, just 1 second. I'm pulling it up.
Okay, no problem.
No sound.
Oh, there's no sound, Daniel.
Millions of dollars from it. She and her team suggested one of the reasons was because the mayor's proposal to substantially cut the district's largest aid program. It's called the Emergency Rental Aid Program, and Mayor Bowser announced that she was cutting tens of millions of dollars from it. She and her team suggested one of the reasons was because of fraud. When the News for I team dug in, Ted Oberg found the district didn't provide any evidence of that fraud. But what our team did find was a program many say is ready for some major changes.
John at Mason knows how all-consuming it is to be months behind on rent.
All the time thinking like, oh, I don't know how many months I'm gonna go on with not being able to pay all of my rent.
Mason's lived in her Marshall Heights home for 6 years, but as she emerged from the pandemic, she was falling behind, telling us her work as a home health aide wasn't recovering fast enough to pay all her bills, and she hadn't paid rent in 7 months.
I'm talking to my landlord. I'm like, I'm behind around. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I need some resource. She said, you go apply and talk to someone at ERAP. I said, ERAP? Never heard of ERAP.
ERAP is DC's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, a multi-million-dollar DC-funded program designed to keep people facing emergencies from being evicted. And Mason says it paid all 7 months of her back rent last year.
Thanks, ERAP put me back on track.
This year, it helped thousands more do the same, but the program is facing huge cuts. Just weeks ago, DC Mayor Muriel Bowser proposed cutting the program from more than $60 million to $20 million, telling council she suspected some DC ERAP applicants didn't really need the money.
You are proposing to cut ERAP in half.
More than in half.
Is that because you believe that half of ERAP applicants are using the program fraudulently?
I believe that there are people who are using ERAP that can pay their rent.
Days later, the director.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so as you see, we had a person in a decision maker, Mayor Bowser, trying to paint a story, paint a narrative that people are trying to game the system. And we obviously know that that's not true. And, you know, these narratives are it's really important to be countering them, because this is another way that decision makers are decision makers are using these narratives to justify the policies that we see in exclusionary displacement. So Miss Mason, I just wanted to shout you out. I think I saw you on this call. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for being willing to share your story with NBC4. And I also just wanted to get a quick sense from you. Why was it so important for you to share your story? And how did it feel to do so?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, I wasn't sure if I took it off mute. Because I wanted to let, DC residents know that ERAP is, will help and fund, if your emergency situation, because a lot of people don't know, like I didn't know about ERAP. So I wanted to share my story, how it helped me and how I found out about it, so others can also use it, if they need it, and know that it will help you in your emergency situation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. And shout out to you again for sharing your story. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Can everybody see? Okay.
Oh,
So there's your picture right there.
I see.
There's Ms. Mason right there, one of our resident leaders. I also, yes, one more thing I wanted to share as far as what we're doing with storytelling, and this is something new that we want to bring to the table. We would like to engage residents in a tenant tea hotline. So this is going to be a hotline where residents can spill the tea on a housing related issue that you think we should be working on. An example of that could be a bad acting landlord that we don't know about, that is having bad conditions issues, not doing repairs. Whatever it is, we want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your stories. Please share them with us, because this really does help us to inform our organizing work. If we're not hearing from the expertise of our residents, then we are not following our values, and we're not able to build that community power that we need to build to truly stop displacement. Okay. So how can folks get involved? One way, of course, is to attend our monthly anti-displacement network meetings. We will have another one of these in July. I will send out the information as I do. I'll give you the reminders, all of that. We also will have our storytelling, as we were just discussing. It's not too late to share your story about ERAP if you have one. And even if your story isn't about ERAP, we want to hear from DC residents about other experiences regarding displacement. We're also interested in hearing experiences, especially we were just talking about the issues with vouchers, and also the issues with rapid rehousing and the terminating of those 2,000 families. So if you have those experiences with displacement or experiences with an essential program that helps you not get displaced, we want to hear those stories. And then we also have, of course, our tenant tea hotline. And then I also want to encourage folks, another way you can get involved with us is to engage in our advocacy. We are constantly packing hearings, whether it's a zoning hearing or the performance oversight hearings or the budget hearings that happened earlier this year. We need to tell our decision makers, the DC Council, we need to tell them what we want and what we want to see in our city, and the solutions that we think are going to work. So we encourage you to please get involved in our advocacy work. We can hold, we did one earlier in February, but we can hold another testimony training. We can, support you going before the council, whatever you need, we are there to support you. So now that you know about some of the things that we're engaged in, we want to hear from you. What resources, relationships, and neighborhood characteristics are needed to help stop displacement in your community? So here I want you to think about the key solutions that you think are important to stop displacement in your area. And then also what kind of actions do you think, start thinking about the kind of actions that we will need to take to implement those solutions. So I'll give us a couple moments to do that. Oh, and I see a question about how can you share your story? You can connect with us. You can contact us. I will share my contact information so that we can walk you through that process. What happened to my chat? Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing for one moment. I lost the chat. Okay. Okay, so I see a lot of awesome questions that are coming up already. So there will be a Q&A portion. I will just say, so the budget hearings are pretty much done. There aren't any relative, like right now, that I wouldn't say that there's any, maybe in the public housing space, the DCHA meetings, but that's more Daniel's realm, so I'll let Daniel talk about that in the public housing space. But yeah. Yes, acknowledging mental health issues is super important. And I like that because it really recognizes that the needs when it comes to displacement go far beyond just providing affordable housing. Yes, relationships, resources in the community, community building opportunities. That's huge. Yes. So I encourage you to continue sharing your thoughts. I'm just going to keep going here. So, and it actually leads into the next thing I wanted to do anyway. So here I have our own, we talked a lot about our recipe for displacement historically and currently, but now we want to create our own anti-displacement recipe for DC. So some of the recipe suggestions I got here are increased funding for ERAP and permanent supportive housing vouchers in the city budget, more job training and employment opportunities, public housing preservation and social housing. But what else should we add? And I'm going to see if I can try
Decrease the
to
cost of living, decrease the housing rate.
decrease the cost of living. Yes. Decreased housing, more affordable housing. Yes. I'm going to see if I can, I'm going to try to directly type these things on here. One moment. Let's see what else folks are writing in. I see jobs. So what I'll start to do is I'm going to gather the things that folks are putting on here, and I will put them on the recipe chart and I will send that out to folks. So don't worry if your thing isn't on here now. I will add folks' thoughts and send it out. Okay. But I do just want to uplift some of the things that people are sharing. I see better options through TOPA. Yes. more revenue through equitable taxation. Absolutely. We were just talking about the need to tax the wealth at the budget oversight hearings. Restrictions on development and rent prices. Yes. Yes. I see a lot of policy solutions in here too. I see a lot of, looking at, inclusionary zoning and what we mean by affordable housing. I think that's super important. And yeah, there should be a zero homeless rate. Absolutely. Housing is a human right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing that. And please continue to share. Okay. So now that we're pretty much in the community discussion part, I want to open it up for folks to, before we get to questions, I'm actually put it back. I want to open it up for folks to come off mute. If you put something into the chat that you want to kind of expand on out loud, please feel free to do so. If you, I guess at this time, we can also take questions. We can just have an open-ended discussion / questions. So if you have something in the chat that you really want to uplift, or if you have something that you need clarification on, please feel free to do so.
I have a question.
Okay, Ms. Simmons, what's your question?
I just want to know, how do they let the balances get so high? Like 20, 30, I mean, even $5,000. How they get behind so much? Because nobody's watching it. I don't understand why they get so high. For instance, I have a resident right now. She's mentally ill. She have 2 kids, 16 and 17. The lady she really done, I can't say flip. I don't want to say that. But anyway, the management went in there, did a, go check the place out. She had mold from up and down. No one came to do the inspection. That's what I'm trying to say. No one did an inspection. She didn't call in for the inspection. It was unbelievable. You wouldn't believe it when I cried when I saw it. How could she live like that over there? She had no furniture, no this, no that. But anyway, the police came and took her out of there in handcuffs. Her children, while she had a 16 and 17-year-old, left her. She don't have a case manager. She don't have a family. She don't have nothing. This is happening right now, today. And I was really appalled. I was really just torn up behind it. It didn't make no sense. That housing let it get that bad, because nobody went checking on her. Even she don't talk to neighbors. She don't talk to no one. And I guess her husband left the kids. So all of them have a problem. The money's been cut off. No rent was paid for months. So that's housing right there. She don't have a case manager. She don't have anything. She don't even have a family that's come to get to see the kids. The kids is there by themselves. Child Protective Service didn't come because they're big kids. They're big, for their age, and they look older than they are, but they're not. And they kind of mental. So I don't know how this is happening. I really don't.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna
Yes.
just sharing my screen. Yeah, that is shameful, especially with all the time. Yes, that is very true. I think, that really speaks to the issue of a lack of accountability from the people that are property owners, and even from the housing authority itself, which is the biggest landlord in the city. So I think there really needs to be, because all I've seen is the fines going up and up and up, as far as like inspection fines and conditions fines going up, but there is no true mechanism to really put pressure on owners to do repairs, and that includes the housing authority. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Hey,
Hi, Ms. Bindle. How you doing?
I'm good. Good evening, everybody. Miss Simmons.
Yeah.
One thing I can speak on about that, because I'm watching it in my building. One of the big issues I'm noticing with housing it's not just housing that's responsible. You got CPS that needs to get involved. You got multiple agencies. You got, DBH, CPS, housing, DHS, a few agencies need to get involved with things like that. You mentioned mental health, you mentioned children, and no one's involved, no
No
caseworkers,
one. No.
right?
She
And
hadn't taken her
all
medicine. She haven't taken her
right,
medicine in years. That means
right,
nobody been watching out for her.
right.
And it's
And
just
that's what I'm
sad.
saying. And nobody's being held accountable for this family. And I'm watching, this isn't a rare situation.
Mm.
It's going on all over the city. It's going on all over the place in these apartments and these homes. And these landlords are taking advantage of these people. The neighbors are meant to suffer, along with it. Housing is not caring about it. DHS, none of these people are caring about the impact it's having on the community. You know what I mean? Because mental illness is at an all-time high, right? The children are suffering because of it. They're going to school and with all kind of conditions they're going in. Housing does not care, nor does DHS, nor does, and you can report all you want. And I'm telling you, I'm experiencing this in my building because I got two families in here that are off the chain. The kids are suffering, and the landlord knows it. He's not doing anything. I'm trying to get out, and the addictions and the mental illness and everything is off the chain. The living conditions are deplorable, and because it's a multi-layered, multi-tiered issue, and multiple agencies need to be involved. You know what I mean?
Right.
But, but at the end of the day, because it is you having a bug infestation, which is housing, like you said, mold, which is housing, infrastructure, which is housing. That means plumbing and you know structural damage, everything, because they're tearing the building up. The landlord and property managers aren't cleaning up and maintaining the properties. None. It comes to housing, but it's being affected. With the effect is because the mental health is not being addressed.
Yeah.
I just want to thank y'all so much for pointing out that these are multifaceted issues. These have multiple layers. And I think this would be an awesome thing to point out in our storytelling, that this is a multi-layered issue, and to show what those impacts are. I see another hand raised. Ms. Shay.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say that sounds like a lack of wraparound services to me all the way around.
Exactly. Daniel, I apologize if I missed any questions in the chat. The chat is lit and I love that y'all are live, but I might have missed a question or two.
No, I think you've gotten to most of them. I mean, folks
Okay.
are making some good points, but I think you got most of the questions.
Wonderful. And I love that attack of the DCHA transformation plan. I do just want to uplift that we do have our public housing organizing work that Daniel runs. I'm sure a lot of y'all already are familiar, but if you're not and you are a public housing resident, I encourage you to get connected so that you can join the public housing power space. I'm just going to read some of the things in the chat that folks are talking about. Oh, yes, an advocacy plan to stop the rising rents. Wonderful. There's a lot of good ideas being shared in this chat. There's a lot of folks, all of y'all have a wonderful, and I didn't even have to, do this presentation. All of y'all already had a very layered understanding of these issues. And I would love to continue these conversations and if it is possible, maybe have more regular meetings to kind of talk about these specific issues, especially when it comes to when it comes to shifting narrative and storytelling, and also when it comes to things like the rising rents and creating advocacy spaces. So if you are interested in that, please, please, please connect with me. I will be sharing my information, and you know, we will be doing more and more of these trainings, not only monthly, but we are looking to engage folks in the in-between time and, you know, more specific working groups that are working on specific issues. So if you're interested in that, especially when it comes to the storytelling, which is what we'll be engaging with over the summer, especially, please reach out to us. If you have any more questions, definitely let me know or put it in the chat. I'm just going to share my screen again. I know that it's getting a little late here and I don't want to keep y'all all night, though I know we can keep having these discussions all night. So
I'm sorry, you said during the summer you'll probably be working on a story about rapid rehousing and the challenges or barriers that people are having with that program?
yes, so that's part of it. We're basically trying to paint a complete picture of the pressures of displacement and then the impacts of displacement and all of the housing programs, you know, including rapid rehousing that play a role in impacting in either displacing people or keeping them in DC. And we think it's important to sort of emphasize people's experiences navigating these different programs as we paint that story of displacement. Does that make sense? I hope that kind of provided some.
Yeah, it makes sense. Are you looking for a positive story or not so positive story?
I wouldn't say that, you know, so I'll say this. When I think about what we did with the ERAP story, when you think about the fact that, you know, when we think about what Miss Mason went through, you know, Miss Mason, and you're on this call, so, you know, the fact that folks were struggling obviously is not as positive, but what we're trying to do is tell the truth. So sometimes it can be a positive story, like, yes, ERAP kept me in my home, but it also means looking at the fact that ERAP is not a permanent housing solution. And so we want to show those stories as well. So some people's stories may be a more positive story, like ERAP helped me to stay in my home, but other stories may talk to those, you know, kind of negative impacts of displacement. So we kind of want to paint a holistic picture with both and.
Okay, thank you.
I know we're so used to either or, and that can seem strange that we're trying to, but to get that holistic picture, we need to hear all of those stories.
Hello, this is Kenya McKeever. Hi everyone. Thank you so much. This is very informative. I really love the advocacy and everyone putting in their good input. But I wanted to know, do you have like certain leaders for, or do Empower have like because we know we have all 8 wards. So y'all have specific people in each ward that looks out for each other under your umbrella, like leaders, or is it just one umbrella?
So maybe, Daniel, you've been here a lot longer than me, and maybe could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we are a citywide organization. We do try to establish relationships and have folks we can count on as leaders in each ward. We don't have like a specific program necessarily, but we do, you know, have strong relationships with people in each ward. And we'd love to add to that list of folks that we can call on that are maybe active in their ANC or active with their church group, or, you know, folks that are out there touching other folks around the issues that we work on. So if you're interested in being part of that, we would love to follow up with you and maybe do a one-on-one and then figure out ways, you know, that you can help us spread some of the work that we're doing. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, y'all, this is where the, you know, the community part of the work comes in. You know, we definitely need y'all to let us know if, and let us know if there is an issue we need to be working on, if there is an area we need to be working on. If you're interested in having us come out to your neighborhood, we really would, need you to be in contact with us and let us know. Well,
Hello. I just like to say, I'm a real estate broker here in Washington, have been doing so for 33 years. What's happening right now is really tragic because African Americans are having a very difficult time being able to purchase in DC. And it's not just low income residents. My business is in Columbia Heights. I live in Columbia Heights, seeing the escalation of prices go up so much that we have Howard University professors who cannot afford to buy in the same neighborhood where they work because of the escalating housing prices. And so if you're talking about creating generational wealth, I think it's a tragedy to see right now. I have a very difficult time selling African Americans homes all over the city, particularly in Northwest, most of Northeast, a few in Southeast, Ward 7, Ward 8, maybe, but then when those houses come on the market, then an investor will come and say, hey, I'll buy the house all as is, all cash, selling in 10 days. So the first time home buyer who has the program has to get financing. So they're immediately cut out. And that's happening all over the city. And then that same investor takes that same house and they may have purchased it for $400,000. They put a couple $100,000 in it, and all of a sudden the house is now $700,000 to $800,000. So these are the kind of